I'm so happy that you're here because I couldn't put your book down.
Hello.
You got it. I couldn't put your book down, partly because it's just such a beautiful book. It's an excellent book, but my family's Cuban too. So reading this was like you get it. You know, you understood everything I've never been able to say. Both of us were also born on an island. We were both born in New York. It's funny, Cuba, for such a small place, it seems to loom really large in the imagination of people. I mean, how is it for you when people find out that you're Cuban? Like, they get really excited, right? And they say all kinds of things about Cuba.
They do, and I mean, I just want to also take a moment and say how cool it is that two Cuban girls are up here on stage in Connecticut. I love it.
We get around.
We get around. People get very excited when they hear I'm Cuban. They're usually surprised because they have an idea in their head of what a Cuban looks like, and I'm not it, I guess. But
Yeah,
I
get that. Yeah, you don't look Cuban.
You don't look Cuban, whatever that is. But I get really excited when people are Cuban. Like, I literally, so the new president at Georgetown University is Cuban, and I sent him a letter to congratulate him just because I was like, I feel like I did this.
Oh my
but
God.
yeah.
You're like connected to
Yeah, we're
everyone
connected.
who's
I mean,
ever.
I haven't heard back from him, but that's okay.
Yeah, but people do. They, if the old cars, the music, the rum, the cigar, the Che Guevara T-shirts. Are you this kind of Cuban? Or are you that kind of Cuban? Are you left Cuban? Or are you right Cuban? What kind of Cuban? Everybody has something to say about Cuba. But as the daughter of a Cuban woman, you've been walking around with this your whole life. And I want to point to a sentence that you wrote that was so terrific. You wrote, I didn't live this escape from Cuba, and yet I still don't know how to turn it off. And I suspect that that's true for so many who are part of a diaspora or an immigrant community. This is a very heavy inheritance. Because on the one hand, there's that rupture and that, unraveling wrought by the revolution, but then there's this remarkable beauty and creativity that's also a big part of the Cuban story. And I think for so many people, they carry that duality. Now that you've written this book, do you find that you can turn it off? Can you turn it off?
That's a really interesting question. I think that a big reason why I wrote this book was because I couldn't silence the stories that I had heard for so long, and I kept hearing them again and repeating them, and something about writing them down and putting them in this book has made it quieter in my mind. And people were like, why was this your first book? And I'm like, this was my first book because I didn't have any space in my head for anything else. That said, I don't turn off the Cuban part, and I think I feel it even more strongly now that I've done this and sat with my family stories and with the history of the island for so long. I feel it so much more than I did.
No, well, definitely if you wrote the new president of Georgetown University, something's still on there. I mean, something. Would you read something for us? Because it sets up the writing of the book. It's on page 39, and it starts. For those of you who haven't read this book yet, she's going to refer to her grandmother Rosita and her grandfather Gustavo in this passage.
The family photographs from Cuba didn't come all at once, but instead were brought to the U.S. over decades by anyone who stumbled upon them and was headed north. I didn't see a baby picture of myself until I was an adult, my mother often says. The photographs now have tiny X marks all over them. Pen marks made by Rosita to indicate where she stands in the photo, where her daughters stand, to call attention to anyone she deems important. Little black or red X's that she draws with the pen she keeps by the telephone, ruining the photos, some might say, but to her it now means more. After my grandfather died, the papers were saved in a plastic box under my grandmother's bed in Miami Beach. In case you ever want to write about this, my mother said, and the papers landed heavy in my hands. The thought of them hurt my head. the Spanish that I had to focus hard on to understand, the yellowing paper and ink fading translucent. I hadn't brought myself to read them, my mother said, but you might be interested. She knew, she told me, that her father filled his pages with stories about the Cubans of the 19th century who helped the island win independence from Spain. There was a symmetry to our interests. My grandfather and I both fixated on the island and wars fought for its future before we were born. At first glance, my grandfather's stories felt too far away, too masculine. I had always sought to understand myself through the family's women. In understanding them, in learning about them, I thought I could fill the hole in my chest that seems intrinsic to anyone whose family has known exile. El exilio, my grandmother called their American life forever. She always filled the word with drama and breath. But el exilio wasn't the beginning. I didn't understand beginnings yet.
I love that. I love that image. It's so poignant of the little X's, those faint X's on the photograph. I see that. I mean, I see in the pen by the phone. It's like it reminds me of my grandmother. I'm interested in that last sentence, el exilio, the exile wasn't the beginning. I didn't understand beginnings yet. What was it about that beginnings that you didn't understand?
So something about, to give you a little background in case you didn't read the book, my family left in 1960 and came to Miami, and I grew up in New York, but that fracture, that cleave in the history really set the tone for the family that I was born into, which was a family very, very preoccupied by this fracture in their history. And to me, that fracture, when I was younger, that fracture was the beginning. That was the beginning of our family story. We started there. We started when they started this new life in the United States and had to figure everything out. And then the more that I sat with it, and then when I started reading my grandfather's papers and looking through the things that I had, I was like, no, the beginning is so much further back than I have any contextualization with. So that was an interesting experience to just sort of, I was only imagining the people I knew, and then suddenly I was imagining people from generations long gone.
Right, like really pulling it back. I mean, you go back to like, you know, you talk about, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but like you go back to the 15th century, really, you know, to explain the why. But in your family's story, it's really great how lovingly you write about all of them. You write about everybody so lovingly, and yet you don't get melodramatic about it. They come off as authentic. Like we see different sides of them. And there's one point where you describe your grandmother Rosita as a woman who, your words were, she survived on delusions of grandeur, which actually sounds very familiar to me. And if you don't know the backstory, it might even sound a little bit unkind, but the thing is that memories are grand. You know, when you're remembering things, they either grow or they diminish. They don't stay the same. And for these people trying to hang on to feelings and sounds and colors and their own sense of self that was so rooted in all of this, I think probably was very grand if fractured. The lens was fractured. And for you, I wonder, you know, our own sense of self, at least initially, really depends on those around us, those who we're closest to. What was it like having that fractured lens of memory as you were forming your own identity?
I mean, it's an interesting question. I think it meant that I grew up with a lot of like mythology about a place, this perfect island with perfect weather and beautiful people, and you know, everything was just perfect. And then the United States, which my grandmother were here, she would say it did so much for us, you know. But it was sort of this fracture between what we had, which was grand, or as they would say, was grand, to what they came with $5 in a suitcase. So that grandeur really, you know, hit the floor. Yeah, it's. I think that, I mean, people often say that being a writer, it means like feeling outside of an experience, so you're sort of always looking in. And I definitely felt that way in my family because I felt like they were constantly referring to this time and this place that I was never a part of and I only heard about. So I was the aftermath of this grand life that sort of kept presenting itself again and again.
Yeah, in terms of feeling on the outside, I think there's a lot in this book about belonging. And after your grandfather Gustavo dies, you feel able to visit Cuba. So now you've been, what, twice?
You've been twice, yeah.
You've traveled there twice. On your first trip, you write that you felt like a tourist on your ancestral earth. And you write about how you're Cuban, but you're not. You belong, but you don't. And even your mother, Margarita, says something similar. She says that she feels ni de aquí ni de allá, neither from here nor from there, that she lives in some kind of in-between. And I wonder, is this something that's just forever for people who are part of a diaspora or an immigrant community? Is it something that's changed for you as a result of this book or your travels there?
I think that I certainly, I feel Cuban American, I would say. I don't feel Cuban. I never lived there. I've only visited there. But it's a question that I've been thinking about a lot because I have little kids, and we were watching Sesame Street the other day, and on Sesame Street, the monsters ate ropa vieja, which, if you're Cuban, is a totally typical, normal dish.
Delicious.
Delicious. And my kids were like, "Mommy, what's ropa vieja?" And I was like, "Oh, wow. Okay, like, this is how..." And I think that's a lot of what I was trying to capture in this book. It's like, your heritage slips away unless you hold on to it really tight and pass it down to the next generation. And I can see it disappearing in my kids. And that's like a sad thing, but I think that's also a reality of time and movement.
Do you think it's time or lack of movement? I'm interested in what you said when you were in Cuba. The Cubans who stayed and heard you speaking in Spanish laughed because they said you speak like an old lady. And I had this too from Cuban friends in New York who were more recent arrivals. They said to me, "Oh my God, habla como una vieja. You speak like an old lady." It's like if we all spoke like Betty Davis or Cary Grant now. We're frozen in the 1950s because that's how our parents, how our families spoke, and they're still speaking like that. It's like they're in amber. And so there's something about us maybe that hasn't moved on from Cuba in a way, and when you were there with the Cubans who stayed, it's something else. How was it to confront that version of Cuba that was so different from the version of Cuba in which you were enculturated?
I mean, you go to Cuba now and it is cast in amber, but like if someone took a hammer to the amber, like everything has disintegrated. And so, I mean, I write about this in the book, but I went back to the house that my family lived in when they lived there. Went inside and looked all around, and things are there that my mother and her family left. The bed is there, the nightstand is there, like pieces of their lives are there. But then there's also what's happened since then. So there's like a huge hole in the ceiling because 15 years ago, 10 years ago, there was a hurricane and they don't have money to patch it up. So that's still there. So it's like, it's this very strange time warp. Like people say it's frozen in time. It's not frozen in time. Time has moved on, but they just haven't been able to do anything to keep up with it.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about the history of Cuba a little bit. If you could just give us like that quick, because you parallel the story of your family with the history of the island. There's a lot of history in this book, and it's really interesting. I learned a lot of stuff that I didn't know. So you've obviously done a ton of reading. There's a lot of notes in the back for other sources that if you want to, if you're interested in that you can consult. Can we run through the history a little bit, beginning in that, I think just the contours of it, because I think it explains a lot. It explains a lot about why we're here. And
I'll give you my tweet version of Cuban history. But yeah, I mean, colonized by the Spanish, ruled by the Spanish for hundreds of years. And then the 19th century was war after war after war of Cuba struggling for independence from Spain. You've probably heard of the Spanish-American War, which the Cubans call the Cuban War of Independence. Americans came in at the 11th hour. Cuba won and we took the credit. And then the 20th century, Cuba was its own island, but really under the thumb of the U.S., run by a series of pretty terrible men, culminating in Fidel. And he came with a revolution that he didn't say was communist, but was ultimately communist. And anyone who was against him had to leave, and that's why my family came, and probably why your family came. And
Oh, yeah, for
Yeah.
sure. How
Yeah.
old was your mom when she came?
my mom was 8. I'm 38. My grandmother was 39 when she left, so I've been thinking a lot about that parallel too, and what it would be like to leave my home now. And she had never left Cuba before, so it was like a big leave.
And who brought the sugar?
To Cuba?
Mm-hmm.
It's an interesting question, but probably Christopher Columbus, but not totally sure.
Yeah, there was a lot, sugar becomes the main cash crop. And then you see how from very early on, there's a point in the book where you talk about how the United States tried to buy Cuba twice, actually.
And I found, when I was doing research, I found all these like cartoons and stuff from the 19th century, and Cuba was often depicted as like a ripe fruit, an apple, that was ready to fall into America's basket. So I think there was this like assumption that either Cuba would become Puerto Rico, or what Puerto Rico became, or Cuba would become a state. None of that happened.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, they came close at the turn of the century with the, after the War of Independence, the Spanish-American War. My grandmother actually, there's a point in the book where you talk about citizenship, and it's about Gustavo. And I thought so much about my own grandmother, who also loved this country. Cubans are super patriotic, we owe so much to the United States. My grandmother, Abuelita Kela, said, that's my sister, Cuban, Tati McLean, Cuban. How many Cubans are in the audience? All right, look at all these Cubans. That's so great. Any other Hispanic people in the audience besides just Cubans? When my grandmother had been living here for years, my father said, do you want to become a citizen? And she was like, ay, chico, I love this country. I love Americans. But I remember watching that Cuban flag go up, because she was born in the 19th century. I mean, she was old. And she remembers being a little girl and watching the Cuban flag go up in the anthem, And she said, I just, I'm going to die Cuban. That's it. I'm not going to, So it's, the two countries have been very, and you write about this, about how they're very entangled. The history of Cuba is very entangled with the United States. And so it's interesting, this book is really interesting because you lay it out very clearly and in very, you don't really take an angle on it. Was that hard? Because Cubans are political. You stayed very measured.
I really didn't want to be political because Cubans are so political, and I wanted this book to appeal to Cubans, regardless of politics or politics now. So yeah, it definitely wasn't totally easy, but it was deliberate.
Yeah, did your family have arguments about politics or anything growing up? Like, did you hear about?
I will say my grandmother, Cubans are in the United States are historically Republican. My grandmother she died a few years ago, but she did whatever my aunt Ileana told her to do, essentially. And Ileana told her to vote Democrat. And so she would vote Democrat, and she got very interested in the Clinton family because they're very interesting to her. And she would read their biographies, but she would put it in another sleeve so that her friends wouldn't know what she was reading.
Oh, that is hilarious. Where, in Miami?
In Miami, yeah.
That is hilarious. So she wouldn't be ostracized
Yes.
from the
She knew
dominoes
that wasn't
game
what
or whatever.
the other Cuban ladies would like.
Okay, so talking about ladies, this is a matriarchy in your book. So you talk a lot about the women, there's a great scene in the beginning, Rosita telling you how you need to learn, Elena, you need to learn. And she said that you needed to learn to be, quote, the kind of woman who fits neatly inside our lineage, full of soft curves and sacrifice and recipes for masking all kinds of pain. So there's definitely an undercurrent of sadness in this family and in this island. Your maternal aunt, Mariana, committed suicide once she was in exile in Miami. And before her, there were others in your family who had struggled with depression and mental illness. And by the time you say you began to feel what you call the gloom, you knew that this was also part of your inheritance. Were you afraid initially, and have you, through their struggle and resilience, like gotten any kind of help from that?
Afraid of writing or afraid of
No,
feeling?
afraid of the gloom.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think that, so yes, my aunt committed suicide. I've traced 7 people in my family who have committed suicide. So it is sort of like a specter that hangs over you. And I think that that's probably something familiar to anyone who has something like this in their family or mental health struggles in their family. You worry, like, am I susceptible as well? I don't worry about that now. I think that was something that was part of my maturation and growing up and realizing that I'm not somebody else, even though we're so genetically tied. But that definitely took some hard times and thinking a lot about it and growth. And suicide is also something very, very difficult to talk about, and something that my family doesn't talk about, which I'm sure they're thrilled I wrote a book about it. But yeah, it's a big thing. And also, what interested me very much was going back through Cuban history and seeing how much suicide actually there is on the island, in the stories about the island. Fidel's son took his own life. There's like a wild story of a radio host on Cuba who said he was going to kill himself on air, and as soon as he cocked the gun to shoot it, a coffee commercial came on. So he died, but the commercial took over and nobody heard it.
Oh my gosh.
Not funny, but funny.
Yeah. Well, Cubans are funny. I mean, they are. I think they said something like the only thing a Cuban can't forgive is if you're not funny, if you don't have a sense of humor. They'll forgive you anything, but lack of humor is not one of them. I want to go back to something you said about how when you grew up, everything was grand, everything was great, everything was perfect. You're always drilling down in this book, calling us to think about reality and mythology. And to me, that doesn't mean, truth and lie, because reality is reality, and mythology isn't a lie. Mythology is, a story that explains something. But it's not quite truth. It's maybe refracted. Can you talk about that? Because it's so huge for us and for Cuba. Really, this idea of Cuba. What's real? What's myth?
I think that I am very interested in what truth is and what one person's truth is versus another person's truth. We're all going to go home tonight with different experiences of tonight, for instance. But I think with Cuba in particular, a mythology was born in the diasporic community for many reasons, but one of those reasons being that they couldn't bring any of their possessions with them. So there weren't touchstones in the way that there are. It's interesting, I've had a lot of Iranian people tell me that this is very similar to their history of exile or Jews in the Holocaust. Just many communities have had to leave everything in a moment of flight. And I think that experience of losing it all really just creates myths. And I don't have a problem with those myths. I think that those myths are sustaining in a way. I think then that I also write a lot about mythology in terms of Castro and how leaders have to create mythologies around themselves so that they seem, godlier than the rest of us. And that's an interesting thing too. I mean, everything is storytelling. We're all just telling stories all the time. So the line between truth and mythology is hazy.
Yeah. Yeah. I love the names in this book. Cubans like nicknames, a lot of nicknames. And so there's some really great ones. La Rora, Chona, Nana, Nena, even the beautiful Celestina. That's such an old-fashioned, beautiful, beautiful name. And I love it. For me, language is absolutely central to my identity. You and I were talking about this, about do you teach your kids Spanish? Because it's like our love language. But then at a certain point, the communication breaks down because we're not as fluent in it as we are in English. How was it for you traveling in Cuba and writing this book with the Spanish that you have? Which is not perfect
No,
and
I mean,
your mother's,
Cubans are very forgiving in that respect, I will say. They would like, "Ay, qué bueno."
Yeah.
There's a lot of cheering you on while you're struggling.
Yeah.
So that was lovely. But there is something about Spanish. I find it, again, with my kids my mom spoke to me in English when I was growing up. My grandmother didn't speak English, so languages were all mixed up in our house. But I speak English with my sons, but there are things that I say to them in Spanish because I've only ever been told them in Spanish. If they're sick and I want them to have a little drink of water, it's toma puchitos, it has to be
yes.
That's the only way for me to express it. But yeah, traveling in Cuba, everyone was lovely. Everyone was so willing to speak and happy to speak. And the situation in Cuba right now is an atrocity, honestly. And there was a lot of conversation while I was there about, how I'm a Cuban man, you're an American woman, but we're not the ones fighting, it's our governments, and I really felt that while I was there. No one was, I was worried that, I was going to be looked at in some type of way, but it was very much no, this isn't your fault. You're not the one making the embargo.
Were they afraid of you?
No, not at all. No. Though I will say, so I went once. The first time I went, it was in the early 2000s. I was in high school, and I felt the surveillance presence much more acutely then than I did the second time I went. The second time I went, I was an adult. I was with my now husband. We were traveling much more under the radar, not staying in hotels and things like that. But the first time I went, it was a big family unit, and it was much more when we were visiting people, keep the door open because people are going to have to come by and make sure that we're not saying anything we shouldn't say.
Right.
That kind of thing.
Right. The title of the book is taken from
Jose Marti poem.
Yeah. Who is, can you tell us?
So Jose Marti is I don't know, like Mark Twain, a writer that everybody in that country knows. And what I think is so interesting about him is that Cubans, no matter their political persuasion, claim him and claim his words and his language. It's he's saying what we mean, even though the other side is saying the exact same thing. But yeah, the quote is, "A mí denme el bosque eterno," which means "give me the eternal forest," which I think is just a beautiful sentiment, but it's also what's on my grandfather's gravestone. So it's sort of a tie to all those many things.
Yeah, and the forest in this context has a healing connotation. The other thing you quote of Martís in the book, it's so beautiful. He wrote that to live in exile is to sculpt clouds. I mean, wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
I can see why everyone claims him.
Well, when I finished reading this book, I didn't want to talk about it. It was so personal, and it just said it all, and I didn't want to talk about it. When you're afraid to talk about something because you don't want the magic to dissipate. I didn't even want to talk to my husband about it. My husband is also, Cubans, all his entire family's Cuban. You really captured something that's so difficult to express in this book. And I think you're right. A lot of people, whether you're from Iran or whether, I mean, I think that there's something very universal here. It explains a lot. Do you think this inheritance dies with us? You've got 3-year-olds. I've got a 25 and a 19-year-old. And they eat ropa vieja, and they know, you know what I mean? They know our families and stuff, but what's going
I
to
would
happen?
like to say no, but like I also know that my father's family is, I think, Welsh, but like that's the point. I think Welsh. Like
Yeah, you don't
things
know.
just dissipate, you know?
Yeah, yeah,
But I'll do my best, and my boys have this, so hopefully that
right.
does something.
Let's open it up to all of you. We have time for questions, conversation. Just speak up. This is an intimate crowd. Yes.
I'll start since I'm the oldest Cuban here.
All right.
I think.
Where are you from?
Santa Clara,
Santa Clara. Okay.
39 kilometers from Cifuentes,
Nice.
where my grandmother taught. She was the first licensed teacher, given a license on May 20th, 1902, the day of independence of Cuba. And she taught in a one-room school in Cifuentes. Her whole family and my family were friends. First time I saw her mother, I must have been 5. She was coming out of the house that you visited, with a hole in the roof, which I also saw in 1999, and I fell in love with her. She had beautiful hair, she had beautiful red lipstick, and the nicest smile in the world. You look like her. And then I met your aunt and your mother, and I fell in love again. They were absolutely gorgeous people and friendly and like my cousins. I played with them, and I have great memories of your mother as a child and your aunt. And I was the last person, I must say, that spoke to your aunt the night before she killed herself. I happened to be in Miami, and I always chased her. I always loved her. And I sat with her and I spoke to her one normal evening, complaining about life, her life as a doctor, and I come back to New York and my mother calls me and tells me this awful story. And I have to say it because I loved her. And you remember her.
Oh my goodness.
Thank
You for sharing that. That is incredible. Thank you so much for being here tonight among friends. That's great.
So thank you for the book.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you for the book. My grandmother was a teacher too, in Matanzas, in the
I
20s.
was a teacher, my sister's a teacher.
Right on. Let's hear it for teachers. And you're a professor. We're always learning. Anyone? Anyone? Yeah.
You've obviously done a lot of writing before this, but this is your first book. What did you learn about the writing process? What's different about writing a book versus writing pieces? What did you learn about
Yeah, because you're a journalist. You write freelance articles.
Yeah, I mean, this took 7 years, so it was like a lot. Had I known that, I don't think I would have had the willpower. I learned a lot about the writing process. In terms of my routine, I figured out like when I write, how I write. I learned a lot about research and keeping track of all of that, which I definitely did not do very well at the beginning. And then suddenly I was like, oh my gosh, I have all these notes and I have no idea where they're from, and like I need to get organized. Articles feel, I love writing short form, but it feels much more like seat of your pants. Like this was something that I really sat with for every day for years and years and years and years, and it's just like a much headier experience.
Right here?
The year before, the year after, started my first job at yearn, which is not far from a large Cuban exile community in West New York.
Yeah, West New York.
Back then, it was now, and I found my bank. I worked for Cuban Revolution. But in commuting there from Westchester, where I grew up, got to know a lot of people that were hired with a lot of Cuban Americans, children of Cuban immigrants. And one of my best friends is still
Oh my
all
God.
the good stuff.
Where do
yeah.
you get that around here? Any recommendations? No way. Okay.
My questions are two. One, growing up in New York City, did you know of or were you familiar with Vermont that frequent visitors because there's so much culture there that stuff settled there? And two, and how was it different than New York here? And two, my wife is from Puerto Rico, who's also from Puerto Rico, and only dated Cuban guys. That was her first non-American descent. But and we married over there 20 years. So we found a lot of conflict over, because her family, the Puerto Rican experience is different than the Cuban experience somewhat. But they're both part of the Hispanic family immigration. So, and we used to talk about Cubans being semi-Jewish and being fun, and not positive in the sense that they weren't hardworking, but yes, of course, Cubans felt superior. And I don't
Oh,
mean
yeah.
that in a bad way.
But that's a Latin American thing. There's a lot of, like everybody has opinions about everybody else, It's not, when you say someone's Hispanic, it's like, yeah, but no. Like
Where are they from?
a Peruvian is not, a Colombian is not, a Cuban is not a, yeah. So your question growing up in New York, right? What was it?
How do you feel that the Cuban and Puerto Rican is that different? Is that part of the fun thing? Do you feel like that's citizenship? Have some sense?
Cubans were very much welcomed, so there was that until, now. I didn't have a lot of Puerto Rican friends or experience growing up, and the Union City Cuban contingent, salud, was not my life. Like my Cuban tether was Miami. My family went to Miami, and that's where we went all the time. Like Miami and New York were very
Right.
closely linked in my mind.
Mhm.
So, sorry, it's not a healthy answer, but
Question right here?
If your grandmother was here today, how do you think she would respond and feel about your book and stories?
Could you repeat it so we can?
If your grandmother were here today, how would you feel? How do you think she would feel about this book?
I think it would be really complicated for her. There are a lot of stories in here that she would tell you, in hushed tones, in the kitchen, not published in a book. So I think that would be hard for her. At the same time, I think that having her, this is her right there, I think having her face on the cover of a book would make her very excited. So I think there would be a divide. But she also didn't speak English, so.
Tough. Okay, you have a question?
On the family theme, I was going to ask you, obviously there's a lot of sensitive stories in here. How was the process of approaching your family and presenting, writing about them? And was that more of a asking permission or forgiveness? How did that whole process go for you?
I have a very small but very close family. It's like, we're all in a text thread all the time. It's dinging constantly. I'm sure I've gotten 40 messages since I've been sitting here. And especially with my cousins, their mother is the one who passed away. And especially with them, I was really, really nervous. I didn't want to upset them. I didn't want them to feel exposed. So I had a lot of conversations, mostly with them. My mom, who I was like kind of worried about too, was sort of like, do what you want to do. So I give her a lot of respect for that. My family, they've been really great. Some of them have decided they don't want to read the book, which is totally their prerogative and fine. And some of them have read the book and are huge champions of it. So it's been a mix.
White sweater?
Elena, was it complicated for you growing up? How much do you put your Cuban heritage forward?
Yeah, I wrestled with it a lot, honestly, and my name is Elena, which I don't think is a terribly difficult name to say, but it was hard for people in first grade, and so I went by Lenny for years, just because I was like, forget it, I'm not like correcting people all the time, like I have a nickname now. I also think that my last name has given me a lot of imposter syndrome in terms of being Cuban. Shepherd is like, Cubans can't say shepherd. So,
Sheppard.
Shepherd.
Elena Sheppard.
So that, yeah, I definitely, I felt like I didn't have the right to claim it for a long time, which was weird. And then something in me softened, and I was like, this is who I am, and I can't pretend to be another person, and it doesn't matter that my last name is not Delgado.
Right, you couldn't claim it, but you couldn't turn it off.
Right, it's
Ni
like-
de aquí ni de allá, you know?
Exactamente. Like, you can't, it's just, you are who you are.
There? The question was, have you thought about publishing it in Spanish, and would that be in a different voice?
This is where you all come in. They're going to be way more likely to publish it in Spanish if I sell a lot in English. I would love for it to be published in Spanish, and I hope that it is. It's a conversation, so yeah.
So my understanding is that more Cubans have left the island of Cuba in the last 5 years than they did back in 1960, 1965, after the Cuban Revolution. And most of them are winding up in Florida. So given that and the new administration's policy on closed borders and trying to fix the closed borders, has there been any change in the republicanism in southern Florida?
Such an interesting question. Yes, 2 million Cubans have come since 2021, which is, I think the island's population is like 11 million. It's a huge percentage of the country. And they're coming because there's no food, there's electricity is spotty, like it's dire. There hasn't been a huge change, which is interesting. I'm curious to see if it does change now because things are getting worse and worse. There was a really great article in the New Yorker about this in September. You should all look for it. I can't remember the man's name, but he writes about leaving one authoritarian government to come potentially to another authoritarian government. There you go, John Lee Anderson.
John Lee Anderson.
I thought that was, he didn't answer the question for me, but he definitely shone the spotlight on the situation and the
Well,
confusion.
you and I talked about this article too, about how interesting that normally, like what you would read about Cuba in the New Yorker always felt a lot more nostalgic about the revolution, you know, like very much like the author wearing a Che Guevara t-shirt while writing the article. And this one was not. This one, I think, was a little bit more unvarnished,
Yeah,
more unvarnished view of Cuba.
He has a very strong pulse on what's happening on the island.
I think we have time for, yeah.
One of the things you mentioned earlier was that you sat with this idea of writing a book for a while. Was there some event or something that happened that one day then you woke up and said, no, now I am going to write this book? What was the motivation to take on this long 7-year process you described to get this done?
I think that it was motivated by fear of never doing this thing that I knew I wanted to do in the back of my mind, and how frustrated and dissatisfied I would be if that were to become my reality. When I sold this book while I was like 3 days postpartum and my children were still in the NICU, and it was like wild. But I think that also thinking about the next generation, thinking about how much my life would change once I became a parent, I was like, if I don't do this and start this like next chapter of my life, then it's very easy that I never will. So I think that played a big part in it.
Well, we're certainly very grateful to you for having written it. I think that all of us, Cuban or not, can get a lot from it. And we have a cart, which you might want to look at on your way out. If you're interested in books that explore culture and identity, you know, there's many, you know, from different cultures, different countries. We have a little cart out there if you want to check some out. I'm going to turn it over now to Elm Street Books. Elena is going to be signing books, and you're free to come and chat her up and meet her. She's delightful. Thank you all for being here
Thank you
tonight.
so much. Thank you, guys.